Hey everybody. So obviously due to the presidential elections, we've had a lot of discourse between those who would call themselves conservatives, libertarians, liberals, whatever. Um, there's a couple of misconceptions that I think a lot of people on the conservative slash libertarian side have, that I think they thought it through, but they actually haven't. And a lot of the stuff they say really doesn't make sense. The two things I want to address the most, however, and I'm going to try to do this as quickly and as coherent as possible, is libertarians and their natural apathy to social issues while still claiming that they understand what it means to be quote unquote socially liberal and fiscally conservative, and the conservative side of the fence, where they think they actually understand what the Constitution says as it regards to state rights and what they do and do not have the power to do. So the first thing, libertarians have utterly gotten on my nerves. They don't make any sense. So first of all, to say that you are socially liberal and fiscally conservative doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And this is why. It shows that you have a serious lack of understanding for the implications an economy has on social standing, and what implication the ability to increase one's social standing has on the economy as it pertains to the limitations that have been imposed over the years, whether it's explicitly, implicitly, systematically, or otherwise. So for example, obviously we know slavery was a thing. So if slavery was a thing, there had to be certain social constructs in place in order to maintain slavery for that amount of time. Because of those social constructs that were allowed to stay in place, that were eventually officially moved, there are a lot of remnants of that those constructs that still exist. For example, as we know, we had not only slavery, but after slavery was over, we had indentured service. After indentured service was over, we had blacks, males and females making less money, but both of them were making less money. They weren't allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. Because of that, I mean, all of this obviously sparks from a level of racism that had to be prominent in order for slavery to even exist to begin with. But because of all of those social restrictions that blacks had at the time, that then led into how much influence that they were not a part of when they over the course of history. So, for example, a lot of the ratification of certain amendments, the creation of wealth at a foundational level that some of the super corporations have today, they couldn't have created that wealth because they weren't even allowed to be part of that process, right? I think that makes perfect sense. Indentured service doesn't mean you're allowed to be Bill Gates. We see some examples of African Americans coming out and breaking that that trend, but it wasn't something that was allowed on a wide scale. So considering that, you had also a level of suburbanization that happened once the blacks moved from the south to the city, and once the blacks were actually doing pretty well for themselves, but then due to suburbanization, they and the refusal of blacks to be allowed to live in those suburbanized neighborhoods outside of the city, the factory workers that were black, a lot of them could not get to the jobs that they once had in the factory. And because education was really not allowed in a lot of areas that were prominently, or actually no, black people just weren't allowed to go to the former institutions that a lot of whites were allowed to go to. They didn't have the means to travel, the income to move, because they don't have a history of having money and security and the safety net that a lot of their white counterparts had. A lot of their white counterparts had a security that comes with a solid family foundation that was allowed to build and accumulate wealth and status prior to them actually existing in the capitalistic market. So with that being said, if I'm a black man and my grandfather or my father was a slave, how the hell could I at all have the same opportunity as a guy whose family was allowed to own a legitimate business and take out loans and become a lawyer or whatever, or start their own law firm or whatever, and they pass down their family wealth and their family their influence and their status throughout history, throughout the history of their family, I mean. So, with that being said, you had isolationism, and that also led to more racial, a larger racial divide. And because of all these factors, the moral of the story is because of all these factors, and if you think they're illegitimate, then you're an idiot. I'm sorry, there's no other way around it. You cannot then expect to say that you're socially liberal and fiscally conservative, because you can't be fiscally conservative, quote unquote, if you don't understand the implications of society on the role that people are allowed to play, or that people have had the opportunity to play in capitalism or the economy today. So claiming that claiming apathy, like, oh, I just stay out of it, let people do what they want to do, that is actually the problem. What it is, it's a beautiful cop-out for people who never have solutions. It is extremely easy for someone to sit back and say, yeah, I don't have any answers, so my answer is let's just let everybody do what they want to. And then when you tell them, when they come to you with their largest excuse, which is that the government is messing up messing up capitalism, which to an extent is true, but it's only true to the extent that's because they allow private organizations to spend money on the government, which shouldn't be allowed. So they come to you saying, we need to get government out of the free market, make sure the market's truly free. And they can't give you one legitimate example in history where letting the free market just run rampant has ever become successful. In fact, we are still seeing the results of letting a free market just roam free, with the fact that Rockefeller family is still ridiculously rich. The Rothschild family is still ridiculously rich. JP Morgan is still ridiculously rich. And a lot of these superpower entities are still rich and still have a ridiculous amount of influence that they accrued from a time that African Americans, Latinos, Chinese, anybody who was a minority at that time was not allowed to accumulate that type of wealth. And if they were, quote unquote, allowed to, they did not have the means, the network, or the status to be able to do so. So stop acting like apathy, like fiscal apathy and like social apathy is a solution to the government's problems, because it's not. Because a lot of you all, once you are confronted with that fact that the free market has, totally free market has never actually worked, then you say, okay, well, we should have maybe limited government act. Maybe the government should be a little involved. Yeah, that's cool. The government should be involved, at least a little bit, because that's why I was fucking created, or else you wouldn't be in this country. If you want to live in a governmentless country, go somewhere in Africa or go somewhere in South America, go live in the Amazons where there's no government. You can just do whatever you want to and see how well a lack of regulation works out. The problem is not the government. The problem is the private sector's influence and allowed influence on the government. That is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. So you libertarians, stop acting stupid. Like, go read a book. That it's really irritating me at this point. Okay, so for you conservatives who swear to God you understand the Constitution, you don't. Like, you don't understand the Constitution. Because if you actually understood the Constitution, you would know the difference between what states can and can't do and what the federal government can and can't do. Most of the conservatives I talk to have actually no idea which amendments dictate what the states can and can't do, because there's not one. There's not an amendment that says what the state can and can't do. What it does is, what the 9th and 10th Amendment does is outline what the federal government can and can't do. And the 9th Amendment specifically says that the federal government does have the right to make sure that the natural rights of the people specifically, not the state governments, but the people specifically, the natural rights ordained by the Declaration of Independence are followed and adhered to, and every person has a right to those natural rights. Obviously, the simplest thing I can quote for time's sake is the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. As you know, we cannot truly be liberated in a society that is based on a system of currency and exchange of that currency without being able to gain that, without having legitimate opportunities to gain that currency. And the pursuit of that type of currency in modern society requires a certain level of education, and a certain level of health. So saying that we have to pay for that education and pay for that health in order to guarantee something that is supposed to be a natural and alienable right, guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence, solidified by the 9th Amendment, and then reconquertorialized in the 10th Amendment, pretty much saying the exact same thing, is like it's ludicrous to say that we shouldn't have free education and free healthcare when it's been guaranteed. And not only is it guaranteed, but the Constitution itself outlines and says that the federal government not only can do so, but has a job to do so, to make sure that certain unalienable natural rights are given to the people, and those shall not be infringed upon. So what does that mean? That means healthcare. I can't live happily if I have to worry about not going to the doctor because I'm scared my insurance premium is too high. Like, I can't live happily doing that, right? If I don't completely understand the world and how it works as far as how different cultures, people, and entities interact, how can I possibly have a good perspective on how to interact in an understanding way with the rest of the world, which is a lot of the reasons why we have the wars and the conflicts that we do now, because people play on ignorance and that lack of understanding. So if I want to live happily, maybe I should have education so I can ensure that I know how to do so. And the pursuit of happiness is something that everyone should be free to pursue. I mean, and what's the way to pursue it? You can't be happy if you're completely uneducated and not knowledgeable at how to pursue how to pursue currency. You can't be happy if you don't have good health care because you're in pain all the time. Like, you can't be happy if you can't take care of your family. You can't be happy if you can't give anything back because you've never been given anything to begin with. There are certain unalienable rights that have been outlined by the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution was created to uphold and make sure that we maintain the Declaration of Independence. Natural rights is something that is spoken of in the Declaration of Independence and then specifically outlined in the 9th Amendment. So if you think you understand state rights, if you think you understand what the federal government can and can't do, just go ahead and double back, because it means you don't understand the Constitution. The states do not have a right to undermine the Bill of Rights at any point whatsoever, which is why we saw slavery get kicked out the window, which is why we saw Jim Crow laws get kicked out the window, which is why we see a lot of the gay marriage and things like that. States don't have the right to restrict rights. If the federal government says it's cool, and I mean, yeah, there's some times that the federal government is wrong, which is why we have a democratic system and we can vote those people out or amend the Constitution or take them to the Supreme Court. But the fact of the matter is, the factuality of it is, the federal government gets to tell you whether or not you have the right to do something. And the fact of the matter is, furthermore, the states do not have the ability to limit rights. They can only grant more rights. However, if those rights are going to be at the expense of someone else's rights, for example, saying that institutions are allowed to discriminate, no, because you're then infringing. You're saying, for example, the North Carolina bill, where they say that any private entity has a right to discriminate against who the hell they want to. Like, no, because then you're discriminating, and you can't do that. It's against the Constitution. It's against the federal government said you can't do it, so you can't do it just because you signed a little state bill. It doesn't work like that, as we've seen by the Attorney General smacked them around for that. So, states' rights versus federal government rights. The Constitution tells us what the federal government can do and cannot do, but more importantly, it does not tell us what the state can and cannot do at all. It just tells us what the federal government can do. The states' rights are important, granted. However, most of the time, the argument for states' rights, if you haven't noticed, considering slavery was a thing and segregation was a thing and Jim Crow was a thing, the argument for state rights is usually some kind of inherent coded language for let's screw over some specific demographic that we don't agree with culturally. This is obvious, right? Okay, thanks. So that's it. Hope you all enjoyed the video and found it informational. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below. Please like and share. Peace.